Well, I think we're in for a very interesting evening because resilience is the biggest issue on the planet now. Resilience of global systems, resilience of organisations, resilience of individuals, resilience of healthcare systems that are supposed to look after them. And in an ideal world, all policy and all practice would be directed towards enhancing human resilience. Sadly, it isn't. But we can live in hope, and we can look at best practice as a far horizon where we're going to move to as the new paradigm develops, as it must. And so over to you, Donna.
Truly, I'm currently a clinical director in probably one of the busiest A&Es in the country, in Barking, Redbridge and Havering. And so anyone that knows Queen's Hospital know it from the press quite often about the things that we so often get wrong. But a year ago I was invited to become the clinical director at Queen's, and I walked into the department on the first day, and I remember thinking, oh, there's a really nice doctor. I could see this doctor teaching 2 students, and I thought, right, that's a really good consultant. Here's one that I've got marked out. And I went up to him and introduced myself to him, and he looked down at the ground. And thereafter, every other consultant looked down at the ground. And this is a hospital that has continually not yet achieved, and I'm saying it in the positive now, because the people I've been working with, we look to the positive now, has not yet achieved consistently the 4-hour standard for emergency departments, that has a RRT that it is failing, the 18 weeks target, and has on average between the 2 hospitals about 650 attendances in the emergency department a day. We currently have probably 5 full-time consultants covering 2 hospital sites. So in all honesty, I've never seen people work so hard in order to cover it. But if you walked into the department a year ago, no one would give you eye contact because they didn't want another job. We had patients that were stacked up in the ED department, so it was not an ED department, it was a ward. They were going nowhere, anywhere fast for 10, 12 hours. And it was a very, well, all I can say to it, for me personally, I just thought, oh my God, this is a sick place to work in. And it felt very sick. And it took probably about 6 months to even have dialogue with a group of doctors that felt so badly abused by both the papers, the system, the NHS, the patients, the local health economy. And so I thought, well, I need some evidence to take to trust board, because everything you do needs to have an outcome, and you need evidence and you need a lot of paperwork. So I actually did a temperature, just took the temperature, tell me what you feel about this organisation that you work for. And it was horrific. You know, doctors talked about being in a war zone. They felt as though they were the whipping boy for the entire hospital. They couldn't even deliver the care. And it got to a point where to find a bed in the hospital to examine, or in our ED department to examine a patient at some time was a challenge. So in a way, we had doctors that didn't want to communicate with anybody within the ED, let alone outside the ED. The patient care was just about okay. They did the best they could to get through it without having too much engagement. But they certainly didn't have conversations amongst one another, and they certainly didn't want to talk to me because although I was a nurse and I was passable, I represented the management infrastructure that was raining down all these things on them. So we worked together really about how would we want to solve this? How would they want to feel? Unfortunately, a good friend of mine that was a nurse, that is a nurse, that was married to a clinical psychologist said, well, look, we could probably help you out here with some work, because actually, if you're saying that your team really doesn't want to have any contact with the outside world, we need to think about how we can get them to be a bit more resilient. So a year later, I think the icing on the cake, it was a huge amount of work, investing time in each and every one of them, allowing them to set the goals, allowing them to sort of get the things off the chest, allowing them to come up with the solutions that they thought that would work in that kind of environment. And a year later, I constantly have people say, I come up and people come into the department and say, how can I help you? So we've moved from no eye contact, looking down at the ground, to how can I help you, what can I do for you. And we still don't have a vast amount of emergency care doctors. We're still struggling to recruit because we're not central London. We are a busy hospital, and why would you come there when you could have an easier time elsewhere? But what I can say to you is that certainly my complaints are down. The words "how can I help you" means that they've gone through this journey and feel so much better about it. And people smile in the department, they talk to you. From going there a year ago, I thought, well, I won't last 2 months here, because actually all I got was a look at the floor. You carry on with the management thing. We're not interested in any target. Don't tell us about that. All I want to do is see my patient. And that's how people began to feel. So were feeling at that time. And to see the change, I mean, if any of you come up, tell me how it is for you, if anybody who lives in the east of London, because people come back and tell me all the time. But it has been a tremendous amount of work that we've put in. But it's been personal work with individuals and then work with them as a team. And it's not easy work. You can't skim it. I had to go and sort of knock on the trust board because it is a trust with a massive deficit. But it's not that expensive to build resilience. And so that's why I'm looking forward to participating in this with you. It's not that expensive, and I think it's something the NHS needs to prioritise. So that's what I wanted to say. Can I now hand you over to Chris?
Thank you. Can I steal the...
Yeah.
Okay, hello everyone. So thank you for that introduction, Donna. I think that's a really helpful place to set the scene with all of this, because what I'll be talking about, well, a number of things really. One is that I want to kind of give a little bit of a background into this word compassion, so have a little bit of a think about what compassion is. I want us to have a little bit of a brief evolutionary tour. It's not something that we would always want to be doing or would be doing on a Thursday evening. But I want to just spend a little bit of time thinking about our evolved capacity to care and our evolved capacity for compassion. But I also want to have a bit of a think about what can inhibit or block our capacity to be caring and compassionate to other people. And then I'll touch on a few things which, from my perspective or our perspective, could be quite helpful in terms of what we could do thinking about compassion in the NHS. So I should say a lot of this work, as David was saying earlier, is linked to Professor Paul Gilbert, who's up in Derby, and linked into the Compassionate Mind Foundation, which is a charity which we have the aims to try to investigate and understand the science of compassion so that we can try to use this in a way that could be beneficial in alleviating suffering and distress and promoting well-being. So, what I want to start with is this idea really of thinking about what is compassion. Now, the thing is, when you start talking to people about compassion, many people will give us lots of the positive words. So it's about caring, about warmth, of kindliness, friendliness, and so forth. And those are wonderful words. But the other thing that often we get when you ask people about compassion is that there are negative connotations that exist in people's minds. So some of the ones that crop up most often are things like, well, it's really a bit weak or fluffy. It's like letting people off the hook, or just means that I just have to keep on being nice to people. Now, this is a significant problem for us, because, of course, if we have in our heads that the word compassion is linked to these negative connotations, most people ain't going to want to practice it. They're not really going to buy into the importance of compassion. So what we've spent a long time trying to think about is, how can we actually define it in the way that is most helpful? And the way that we've been trying to work on this is thinking that compassion actually can be seen as having two different psychologies. So a definition that it's not just that we would use, but that many people would use across the globe, is that compassion is a sensitivity to the suffering of self and others and the causes of that suffering, with a deep commitment to try to alleviate that suffering. And even maybe at the end of that, there's a sense of trying to prevent that suffering from coming back. Now, the point is within this definition, and it's a very common definition shared by many people, Buddhists, many people who are investigating and interested in the science of compassion. What we begin to see there is we split this into two psychologies. This first psychology, we would say, is this one. So that compassion involves a sensitivity to the suffering of self and others. And what we mean by that is that actually to have compassion, we need to be sensitive to be able to tune into the suffering, the distress of the other, or our own distress, that we can engage with it, we can move towards it rather than cutting away from it. So as Donna was talking about things earlier, you can see there that there can be significant problems for us because actually we can turn away from this. We can keep our eyes closed. So the first psychology we think is almost this tuning into, moving towards to, having the capacity to engage with suffering. But of course, we don't just want people engaging in suffering just for the sake of it. This second psychology of compassion is so important because this is all about motivational psychology. It's all about trying to alleviate, doing something about it, no matter how small. So of course, there are times where I can't take someone's cancer away, but there are still things that we can do to try to alleviate some of the suffering around that. So what we're talking about here from a CFT is compassion-focused therapy, but this is just generally within our approaches, these two different psychologies that we're really interested in, the ability to understand, engage, move towards, rather than cutting away from, experiential avoidance and so forth. And then this second one, this desire, the motivation to do something about it. Now, as we start thinking about this, what we're really interested in, if we think about both in terms of, this is an approach we use a lot with many of our clients who suffer from a variety of mental health problems, but also if I'm thinking about trying to train up and help people that I supervise, staff members in the NHS, is that of course with these two psychologies, with these two here, we can experience blocks in one or the other or both of them. So I want you to hold that in mind a little bit as we talk about this, that actually some of the blocks to compassion can be because actually we turn away from suffering, a bit like Donna was saying, in a way there's a kind of closed down, looking away from. But also sometimes it is actually, I just don't know what to do. I don't quite know how to help here. So there can be a collapse in the system as well. Now, as we're looking at this, what we're beginning to think then is that to do these two things, to be sensitive, to move towards, to engage with suffering, and then be able to have the motivation to try to alleviate it, that is not about weakness. There is nothing soft or fluffy or pitying about that. In fact, actually, to do this, you need a good dose of resilience, of strength, of courage, of distress tolerance. So actually, compassion is not a weak thing at all. In fact, if we're really clear about it, it is not any of these things. It is not a luxury. It is not a weakness. It is not an indulgence. It turns out, actually, compassion sits at the heart of the development of our morals. Actually sits at the heart of our ability to look into the nature of distress and try to deal with it. And actually, in its essence, often compassion needs to be rippled with a lot of strength and courage. Now, if we begin to think about people internationally, if we think about famous people who we would ascribe to being compassionate, the key one always was Nelson Mandela. So we think about Nelson Mandela and some of the qualities that Nelson had. Of course, lots of people will say he's very warm, very kindly, very friendly. But would you ever describe Nelson Mandela as being weak? Would anybody have ever said that Nelson Mandela was a weak man? Of course not. So we can begin to see that actually people who ripple with compassion, it's not that this is a weakness, a gentleness, just allowing people to ride roughshod over you, that actually this can be a real sense of strength and a real sense of determination here. So when we start thinking about compassion, what we think within this is, though, that there are a variety of different attributes that might contribute towards our capacity for compassion. Now, one of the things that we begin to think about here is that probably you do need to have a good dose of sensitivity to be able to tune into the nature of suffering, whether it's your own or somebody else's. We probably need to have a degree of sympathy. So in our model, what we mean by sympathy is the automaticity of feeling. You're crying, I have a sense automatically of this. I feel with. I don't have to think about this. It's a little bit like this idea now we're finding more about mirror neurons in the brain, that actually if I see someone's hand get slammed in a door, that actually in my brain the pain sensors light up as well, automatically. We also think, though, that compassion probably needs to have empathy. So this is this idea then of an imaginal quality, being able to reach in, consider what is it like for the other. Not what is it like for me if I was going through this, but what is it like for them. Now, of course, as we start doing all of these things, and actually I should say as well, of course, the starting point often is here, just being bothered about someone's well-being, being bothered in the first place, being motivated. What we see as we begin to do all of these things is, and certainly those of you who've worked in the NHS will recognise, is it can get tricky because you do start engaging with a lot of pain. So one of the key qualities of compassion then is distress tolerance. That actually we need to have a capacity to be able to tolerate other people's distress, but of course our own distress. Because working in the NHS and being in contact with pain and suffering is hard. The other bit, of course, that we try to tie in, and this ripples in many different approaches to compassion across the world, is that we try not to judge. Now, this isn't meaning that we don't have preferences. What it means is that we just try not to be critical and judging of people. Now, all of this stuff comes together within our model. We're thinking that we have these attributes here, but the key thing that we're trying to do in therapy, but I think this is important just generally for us when we're learning about compassion, is that we can do this, we can help to cultivate this in people. Now, I'm going to come back to this point later on. We've had a controversy over many years when people say, you can't teach compassion. Well, actually, you can cultivate compassion. I'm going to come back to this, but you can, and it is possible. And actually, in our psychotherapeutic approach, what we recognise is that there are a variety of skills, of things that you can get people doing that helps to cultivate compassion. And these things are this outer ring here. And what we do here is try to help to train people's attention up so that they can notice their own suffering or the people's suffering in a better way. A little bit like, in a way, we get them to keep their heads up and actually being able to look and notice what's going on around them. We use a lot of reasoning. How can we help people to think about, by thinking about things in a particular way, if we direct this and to try to cultivate this capacity for empathy, for example. We try to help people to behave in compassionate ways. So how by behaving in compassionate ways on a day-to-day basis, actually I might be able to tone up my capacity to deal with some of this and so forth. But today's talk isn't so much about this, but I do want you just to hold this in mind, because what we're recognizing is that when we get people practicing this, people can have a sense that their capacity for compassion, both for themselves and others, can improve. And one of the things that this falls back to, though, is as a species, we have a huge capacity for this. We have a huge capacity for compassion, caring, and kindness. Many of you will recognize some of these pictures, wonderful examples of compassion from across the world. We've had Muslims protecting churches when there have been terrible things going on in the Arab Spring. We've had it the other way around, Christians protecting Muslims praying. We've had wonderful examples of people in awful situations being compassionate, and of course we know this health service of ours in many ways was founded on this principle of caring for the other, of looking after, of actually going out of our way to support each other. And this is a wonderful capacity, which I will return to shortly, which is deeply rippled in our evolutionary history. But one of the key things we also have to recognise is that there's a big however to this. That whilst we have a huge capacity for compassion, we also can struggle with this. And what we mean by this is in understanding compassion, we also need to think about what turns compassion off. What makes it happen, and what causes at times for us to struggle to have compassion and care for other people, where actually we can literally dissociate from other people's suffering. And this is an important area. David and I were just talking about this, and there are ideas now about how can we understand the idea of dissociation, not so much out of trauma, per se, where we've often been looking at in terms of dissociative processes, but just as a general human process in which this mind of ours can get overwhelmed and we can cut away from, we can turn off from. And it turns out that actually this isn't our fault. This is almost like an inbuilt mechanism of this brain of ours to try to deal with overwhelming situations. But actually, once we start understanding how certain contexts can make this difficult, this can be helpful for us. Now, what we mean by this is, as much as we as a human race can have a wonderful capacity for looking after people, and have a wonderful capacity for treating people with kindness, with respect, with dignity, we also know that we can actually see this kind of stuff. We know this is happening. Not too far from our doorsteps. We know that this happens, both in our country, in this city, but across the world. Do we connect with it all the time? Do we think about it all the time? We know human beings can be horrendously cruel to each other. We know for so many years human beings took pleasure out of harming people. We know this stuff. This is the capacity we can have inside our own brains for all sorts of things. And the point here is, we're a wonderfully intelligent species, but when it gets hooked into some quite difficult dynamics, human beings can be exceptionally destructive. The other thing that we know alongside this, though, is that if you change the social context on people, people start acting in very different ways. We've got wonderful social psychology experiments showing just this. Good old Milgram's experiments powerfully showed how actually, just by telling somebody to give somebody else an electric shock, so telling somebody off the street, I want you to turn this up now and you're going to give an electric shock to somebody across there in another room, people would do this. If you ask them beforehand, though, would you ever do this to somebody else? Of course, people will say, no way. But actually what we've shown is that when under authority, human beings can be so submissive. And we also see this, many of you will know Zimbardo's work, the Stanford Prison Experiments. He got a bunch of people off the streets, just normal kids, split them into two groups, one who were the prison guards, one who were the prisoners. And lo and behold, within a few hours, you get awful things happening. The prison guards treating the prisoners like dirt. The point is, if you change the context on people, if you have a context which is unhelpful for these brains of ours, this can cause us significant problems. And do we know this about the NHS? Well, absolutely. Because, of course, we can see terrible things that can happen, but we have to understand the context. Just blaming people isn't that helpful, because actually when we begin to understand the context that surrounds this, just as we understand with Milgram and Zimbardo's experiments, we understand this human mind of ours is vulnerable to these things. Now, before I get into some of this stuff, I need to take you a little bit back into thinking about the evolved capacity in our brains for different emotions. What we mean by this is that we can be motivated for all sorts of things, huge compassion and care, huge amounts of competition and so forth. The point is that actually motivations evolve because they drive humans towards things that are important. And our emotions evolved, as much as we can tell, because they tag on to our motivations. When we're doing well, they respond in a positive way, fills us with certain types of positive emotions. When we're thwarted or blocked in our motivations, we can experience some negative emotions. And out of some of Paul Gilbert's work, and this is deriving from a lot of the neuroscience and neurophysiological research of Panksepp and Dupuy and people like Ledoux, what we've tried to do within this model is suggest a heuristic, a simplification really, of emotional systems inside of our brains. And what I want to do is just take you through this really quickly, just to give you a sense of how this might work for us, and how in understanding this as individuals, we might understand how we can struggle with compassion at times. So the idea here is this model. We call this the three-circle model. What I'll do is just take you really quickly through these three circles. The first one that we start off here is this one. We call this the threat system. We think this threat system evolved in us, but all other animals walking this earth, to do some really important but basic things. Detect threats in the world and make you want to do something about them. Get safe, protect yourself, and protect the people that you care for. And alongside this, when we detect threats in the world, we get neurophysiological changes in our brain, we get a stress response, we get certain emotions, and an urge to do certain things. Now, to give you examples of this, I can take you through quite quickly. If you were walking home tonight and you turned the corner and you saw these guys standing there, probably it'd be your threat system that starts kicking off in you automatically. You would get a rush through in your body of a stress response and probably a fear and an urge to move away. So this is your threat response, just trying to help you out. The interesting thing here, though, with our threat systems is that whilst we think it evolved to try to protect us from physical harm, human beings are the most social of species. So many of our threats are social threats. Now, of course, from a compassionate point of view, we wouldn't say rejection, it starts from an early age, just get used to it. But the point is here, you can see that rejection, and many of us will know this personally, rejection is very threatening for us. But the other thing that we know, these types of things create huge threats for us. Sense of being a failure, not being good enough. And actually, when we start thinking about this in the context of broader social and structural organisational things, then we can see that actually this threat system of ours can get heated up quite quickly. So this is our threat systems. Now, whilst this links to negative emotion, this red one, this blue one up here, this is a type of positive emotion. And this is a system, we call this the drive system. This is a system that we think evolved to give you bursts of positive feelings that urge you towards things. So this is a system which is very much about getting things, having things, achieving things. And actually this system, when you get those things, it leaves you feeling good. So this is kind of a reward-based system. And actually the emotions that go with this are more kind of buzzy, positive, high-energy emotions. Now again, it's probably quite helpful just to show a few pictures here. It's probably this system that you would get a big whack of if you won £10 million on the lottery this weekend. It's probably this drive system that you get a good hit off when this happens. It's probably the drive system if, like me, you're an Arsenal fan, your team wins the cup. But also it's probably the system when good old Mo wins the gold medal. So this is a system, as you can see here, which is tied in to achieving, of wanting, of pursuing. It's a wonderful feeling when we get it. But what else can we see here that is interesting in this picture? So the problem here is, of course, this drive system is wonderful when we're getting, when we can achieve, when we can win, when we are successful in our targets. But sometimes, and quite often, we can't get there. And for some of us, at times, what we begin to recognise is that we aim for the blue, but actually underpinning the blue, there's a lot of red. And I'm going to come back to this idea that these two systems can get toned up together in our certain context that we work in. The final system I want to tell you about here is the green one. We call this the soothing or affiliative system. And this is a system in which we get a type of positive emotion, but the positive emotion is more the sense of feeling safe, of feeling calm, of feeling soothed. It's a sort of positive emotion in which we're not experiencing any of the reds, we're not driven to achieve anything, but it's a type of positive emotion that you might have experienced if you're just lying on a beach. You're not doing anything, but you feel this wonderful sense of well-being. It might be a type of positive emotion that you feel in the presence of a loved one, just in the presence of them being there, somebody you feel secure around. Sense of just feeling content and connected. Now the point about this system is that it's underpinned, we think, as far as we can tell, by the neuropeptide oxytocin, and also by the opiates and endorphins. Now, the point being about this is, as far as we can tell with things like oxytocin is, oxytocin seems to be a potent, natural, evolved way of regulating threat. So what we know now, for those of you who are more on the physiological side, oxytocin naturally seems to regulate HPA, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal functioning. So it helps to calm down the threat system. What we understand now, when those of you who might have seen about oxytocin in the popular press, people talk about oxytocin as being the hormone of love, or the cuddle hormone, or the hormone of trust. The point being is, we get spikes of oxytocin when you're holding hands with somebody that you feel secure with. You get spikes of oxytocin when you're having sex. Mums have spikes of oxytocin in childbirth and in breastfeeding. We also get bursts of oxytocin when we're playing, engaging with our kids, when we do give people hugs. So what we're seeing here is oxytocin seems to be very linked into care, trust and bonding. And the reason for this, we understand, is that whilst turtles, as a reptile, when they hatch and run towards the water, and unfortunately you've seen these programs, they often get eaten by all these birds swooping down. During that process, mummy and daddy turtle aren't there. So in reptiles, what we see often is this idea of avoiding others, moving away from. And parents don't do any parental protection. There's no nurturance, there's no protection here. But about 100 million years ago, we had the emergence of mammals in the world. And mammals do something completely different. And as a mammal, what we do, of course, is have very few offspring, but we put a huge amount of parental protection, nurturance and affection into place. We do closeness. And if you think about it, if a young child is distressed, if their threat system is lighting up, they're crying, what is the thing that mum or dad might do to try to soothe that threat, that distress? Of course we know. Closeness, contact, affection. So what we understand here is that actually other people are often a significant way of calming our threat system, our distress. Now it's out of that, of course, that human beings can start extending their care and their compassion, not just to their children, but to other people that they're not related to. And this is a wonderful endowment for us, because what we're seeing here is that this system can naturally calm here. Now, how does this all relate to this NHS and to us staff who work in the NHS? Well, I think in a number of quite important ways. Let's have a think about how are these systems balanced, these three systems balanced, in many of the people that work in the NHS. So if we ask this question, this is often what we get back from NHS staff. A huge threat system, huge threat system. Feel overwhelmed, feel stressed, feel anxious, feel under pressure, feel burnt out. Actually quite a significant blue system. There's a sense, I have to do, I have to see more people, I have to do. But of course, as Donna was pointing out, this can actually go offline. People can actually get shut down to this. I'm overwhelmed. And when it comes to the green, how large do you think people draw out the green system if we give them a piece of paper to draw this out? Tiny. It's like a little pea. Now the point here is that if this is the way that your emotional systems are balanced, what are the consequences? What is this going to be like as a member of staff working in an organisation? Well, one of the things that we recognise here is that actually it's hard. And if we begin to think about creating balance instead, what would this look like? What we're talking about here is trying to reduce the red. Because what we recognise is that actually if your red system is like this, how are you going to be looking out on your patients? How are you going to be thinking about them? How are you going to be thinking about your colleagues or your managers? Or somebody wonderful like Donna when she comes along to try to find out what she can do to help. Of course, if you're stuck in a threat mind, you will perceive the world, you will think and attend to things in a threat-based way. This is just what happens in the brain. So what we're trying to do here is thinking about reducing the red, but of course you can never get rid of it. We need the threat system. If you didn't have a threat system, you would walk outside tonight and you'd be run over by the first bus that went past, because you just wouldn't register it as dangerous. So we need a threat system, and we certainly need the blue, because this is all about doing, about engaging with, and activation. But of course what we're talking about here is we probably need access to the green. Now, let's think about these three systems though, but thinking about it actually, rather than for our staff, sorry this is repeating itself because it's so important, if we actually think about what systems the NHS fosters, how do you think people draw out these three circles when they think about the trust they work for? Well, what we get is the same bloody thing. Huge threat system. Significant blue system. You need to do more. You need to be seeing more people. See them quicker. See them sooner. And how much of the green do people talk about in terms of their sense of their NHS trust? Managers and so forth? Well, often very little. So what we begin to think about then with these three systems is we can think about it as individuals and what we can do for ourselves, but we also have to think about the context. If this is the context, the system that you're working in, this is going to be tricky. And what we would say is that this might actually be a balance which actually begins to interfere with people's natural capacity to be compassionate. So having this type of setup is tough for us staff to maintain compassion. Now, as we're starting to think about this, and we actually ask people to think about what would go in each of these systems in your NHS workplace, in your team, what people often say to us is that they get a huge dose of this. In the threat system, high workload, lots of job insecurity, frequent changes, lots of reorganisations, high stress, a sense of criticism from others. And what about the blue? Well, people will tell us. There's lots of me first, more for less, meeting targets, competing with colleagues, striving, 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 go faster, go faster, go faster. So we know these really heat up, they get really blue. But what sits in the green? Well, often many people will say, there's little time for relating. There's actually a lack of support or care. Actually, I don't feel valued or wanted. People don't allow emotions. I don't feel safe. And it's almost like this system goes offline. So we're just operating on these two. And that's tricky for us. It's not how we're set up to be. If you remember, this green system is one of the natural ways that we regulate threat and distress. So what we begin to think about then is, under these conditions, what are the consequences for our healthcare staff? Probably these things. This is what we hear from our staff. This is what Donna was talking about when she first went in to her trust. And what we see here, of course, is that these things block our evolved natural human capacity to care for each other. These are the things that can shut this down inside of us. And therefore, to begin to think about this and what we're going to do, we do have to think about this in a global way, in a systemic way. So whilst we've already talked about this red and blue and what happens, maybe what we need to do is more of this green. So maybe the NHS can step towards this and cultivate a sense of we-ness, a sense of trying to value and support our staff, supporting each other, a sense of shared values. Why is it again that we're working for the NHS? What is it about its culture that we really love? A sense that maybe we can slow down, that actually maybe we can allow emotion, facilitate this sense of we-ness. And with all of this, what we begin to think about then is, what are the things we could do? Now, I'm just going to talk about this very briefly before I finish, but these are just a few ideas. The first thing that I'm going to think about is that maybe we can start with ourselves. Now, I'm not talking about this. I'm not expecting that I walk onto an A&E ward and I see one of our consultants sat like that. It's not realistic, but what we are talking about here is that maybe compassion needs to start at home. That actually, if I can't have compassion, remember that compassion is about being sensitive to distress and trying to do something about it. If I can't have that for me, I don't know about my own distress, and I don't know how to deal with my own distress, how the hell am I going to go out, day in, day out, helping people, my patients, who I know are going to be suffering? So one of the things we can begin to think about is, how can we create an inner balance here before moving? What we mean by here is a sense of groundedness, to be able to slow down first. So what we thought about with many people is, and you look at this with people like Tom Daly, you see him on the top of a diving board. They don't just walk up and dive off straight away. They compose themselves. Gymnasts do this before they do their tumbles. Martial artists will tell you, you don't move from being off balance, you get balance first. And actually this is quite a powerful thing for us to think about us. Let's think about nurses, psychologists, psychiatrists, consultants. How about we start our shifts first of all by slowing down and try to cultivate a part of us that has some balance before going in to all the difficult stuff. Maybe actually we can become more sensitive of our own distress and think about ways in which we can begin to alleviate this. And one of the things that we know now, and this is something which people have been practicing across the world, is if you practice things like mindfulness, breathing techniques, compassionate imagery, compassionate acts, this can actually help to cultivate a different type of feeling inside of you. And there's a lot of research on this, ladies and gentlemen. We now know compassion can be cultivated. You can teach this. We know now that actually if you get people practicing compassion-based imagery just for 6 weeks, you scan their brains pre and post, you see structural changes in their brain. Your brain changes when you practice this, just imagery of compassion. But also what Pacetel found is, you practice this over 6 weeks, your immune system improves. Just think about that for a moment. You just imagine compassion and your immune system can improve. We also know that if you practice compassion, not only do you experience a reduction in negative emotions, threat-based emotions, you also experience an increase in positive emotions, happiness, joy, and so forth. We also know that if you practice compassion, this is a nice social psychology experiment in which they got a bunch of students, they split them into 2 groups, got some people practicing self-compassion, got some people practicing self-esteem. When they compared these 2 groups together, they found some really interesting things. First thing was that the self-compassion group had greater motivation to make amends following a moral transgression. The self-compassion group had spent more time studying for a difficult test following a failure. And actually the self-compassion group had greater motivation to change a perceived weakness. The point here is, self-compassion isn't just this internal, oh, I feel wonderful. This is all about engaging in difficult things. This is about motivation, helping you to get back on the horse once you've fallen off. So actually, if you think about healthcare staff here, this would actually be facilitating resilience and helping us to get back in there again. But also, the other thing that we found is, and it's only tentative research now, you get staff practicing this, meditating on this, and what we find is they experience, in comparison to those who don't practice this, a reduction in burnout and a reduction in compassion fatigue. So these are real findings, ladies and gentlemen. This isn't just something which is on an abstract level. We can see this physiologically, emotionally, the way we think, and also in our behaviours. The other thing, very briefly to go into, of course, it's not just about the self. We do need to think about the we. So this is actually thinking about how can we together create strong foundations. We build a house on strong foundations. How about we try within our teams to create similar strong foundations? Again, it might well be here. How can we go about purposefully in our NHS teams cultivating kindness and compassion and care to each other? How can actually I look out for the distress of my colleagues and then think about what can I do to try to support and help them? How actually can I become aware or help my colleagues to become aware of what system are they functioning in? How can I help them to begin to contemplate this? But also, and here's a big one for us working in the NHS, how easy do we find it to receive the care and compassion from other people? How many of you, when one of your colleagues is seeing you distressed, has actually displayed compassion to you and you've tried to push it away? Oh, I'm fine, I'm fine. So one of the things we recognise here is often we can be quite blocked to the care and compassion of others. It leaves us feeling uncomfortable, or we feel that we don't have time for it. We just need to get back in there and just continue. So maybe there's something here in a bi-directional way of cultivating relationships with our colleagues to help us all do the job together. And what evidence do we have of this? Well, there was a lovely research project that was done by Crocker and colleagues a number of years ago now, in which actually she asked students to rate what their self-compassion or their self-compassionate goals were, or their compassionate goals were for the weeks ahead, versus their self-image goals. What they meant by that is self-image goals were things like, in this next week, I'm going to try hard not to make mistakes that other people will notice. Or in this next week, I'm going to try hard for people not to criticise me. So those are self-image goals. Self-compassion goals were things like, I'm going to try my best in this next week to try to be there and to be caring for my friends. So what we found based on that research was that those people with high levels of self-image goals, trying to protect themselves, not look like a bad object to other people, those people over the weeks reported a greater sense of isolation, a greater sense of stress, a greater sense of disconnection from others. Interestingly, those people who had high levels of self-compassionate goals, over the weeks what they found was that they were more connected with other people. But interestingly, Crocker also measured the people that they were living with. And what they found was that people who had high self-compassion goals, their colleagues, their friends that they were living with, experienced their kindness. They experienced their compassion in a positive way, so much so that they were more likely to express it back to the first person. What I mean by that is we start to get reciprocity. It goes out there, people experience it, and they are more inclined to direct that back to you, and you can experience that. So we begin to literally get reciprocal relationships built upon care and concern. The final slide, just to show you, ladies and gentlemen, of course, is thinking about higher up. Because whilst all of this stuff is wonderful, we also need to think about our managers. Now, there's lots of ways of thinking about this, but I think one important thing is how are we selecting, training, and supporting our managers to be able to do a job which actually is very, very difficult? How are we going to help them and have compassion for them, given that they've got a manager who's probably hurling a lot of threat and drive stuff down to them? So how can we actually reach out and recognise this is hard for our managers too? Because what we recognise, and our research is showing this now, is compassionate leaders are more able to cope with these things in much more positive ways. We've got a lot of evidence now coming from the States and so forth in which compassionate leaders facilitate difficulties in a more positive way, in which actually their staff experience this, will have less absenteeism, will have less days off ill, will have a greater sense of wanting to stay in the organisation and so forth. So the point is, when we cultivate compassionate managers, the staff notice this. They feel differently. They want to be part of rather than leaving. The bit to say about this is that there is some evidence as well that you can spot this. So Condon et al. Last year, and this is the final thing I'll say, they did this lovely study in which they got a group of people practicing mindfulness and compassion over a relatively short period of time. It was just 8 weeks. And then they had a control group. This was a bunch of people who didn't do anything. They were a little bit sneaky with these people, because these people who were in this experiment didn't realise they were actually still in an experiment. Because what they did after this 8 weeks, they got the people to come and sit in a waiting room, a bit like a GP waiting room, and sit down on chairs. And the experiment was, these poor people didn't know this, that they got a stooge to come in of the experiment, walking into this waiting room, all the chairs are occupied, but this person walked in on crutches in obvious pain, and stood in front of these people, sat down, and of course the experiment was how many people would notice the person suffering, get up out of their chair and offer their chair to the person on crutches. And what they found was that those people who practiced mindfulness and compassion were 5 times more likely to do that. 5 times more likely. Now let's think about training our managers. They would be 5 times more likely to notice the stress and suffering than the people they supervise. But let's just think about training all of us in this. The point being is, this can be cultivated. It can be trained. Of course, we have wonderfully, naturally compassionate people in the NHS. But I hope what maybe this talk has shown a little bit is that this compassion is vulnerable. And that actually, if we go about trying to cultivate and practice this explicitly, this might help us in a variety of different ways. Thank you.
Over to you, Jill.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Wow, how am I going to follow that? We had an opportunity to swap the way we went. I wish I'd gone first now. And then but I'm going to take us back much more to the NHS and to the experiences of nurses and doctors, and I'm going to explore with you some of my research. And that's really taking a slightly different slant to Chris, but coming to some of the same conclusions, is that what my argument is that I've said, can compassion be eroded in NHS staff? I think we probably know it is, and I'm going to take you on a journey to show you how that happens and what sorts of practice environments erode that and what supports staff to care. What do good practice environments look like in terms of supporting staff to care? And some of the things I'm going to say are quite resonant, or one might say repetitive, of what Chris has said. But as he said, really relating to patients takes courage, humility and compassion, and it requires this constant renewal by practitioners and a recognition, reinforcement and support from colleagues and managers. It can't be taken for granted. And I think one of the things that we've managed to do in the healthcare is take it for granted. I think certainly Mid-Staffordshire was a situation, and there are many others, where it has been taken for granted that every day you will wake up in the morning, you will put on your uniform or your white coat and you will go to work and you will give of yourself in a way that very few other people are asked to give of themselves in their work. And that you will do that day in, day out, and that you will see things that are very distressing. You will see people your age dying. You will see people who could be your parents suffering. And you have to sort of take that on board, lock that away, and do something with that. And I think people need support to do that. And I think we haven't been very, very supportive of staff and helped them do that. I thought I'd better do that in a session about compassion, but very much echoing what Chris has said. This is the Chochinov definition. So it is about this deep awareness of suffering, but also this sense of wanting to do something and alleviate it, as Chris has said. And it's about tolerance and non-judgment and so on, and action. And drawing on Chris's work and Paul Gilbert's work, which I know quite well, this really is reiterating much of what Chris has said, but to say how much the NHS culture is a threat environment, and that threat and fear inhibit compassion. It's a time-pressured, accounts-driven, job-threatening, overwhelming, bullying, whistleblowing environment in many places. Not everywhere at all, but in poor trusts, in trusts that are really struggling. And it doesn't mean that they're poor trusts because they're full of bad people. It means they're poor trusts because they are, as we saw in Mid-Staffordshire, they've taken their eye off the ball, or they've got their eye on the accounts, or becoming a foundation trust, or whatever it is, and that they're not taking care of their absolutely best asset, which are their staff. And so compassion grows in compassionate, supportive environments where staff feel safe. I just wanted to draw your attention to this report, and we've got Jocelyn Cornwall in the audience, who is the director of the Point of Care Foundation. It's an independent charity working to improve patients' experience of care, and this report is talking about how you engage staff in the NHS and why it matters, and I do recommend this to you. But Jo Cubban here, Chief Executive in Taunton, she was saying it's not an add-on or an extra expense. It's a fundamental part of how you operate as a hospital. I would that all Chief Executives got that and said that. And giving people the freedom to act is actually very difficult, but it can be liberating as well. And being brave in allowing people to make mistakes without fear of blame. And I think we're in a very, very challenging situation at the moment where perhaps post-Francis we need that to happen more, but also because of Francis it may happen. I don't know if it'll happen less, but I think it's really difficult. We've had so much blame, and particularly of nurses, I would say, that it's very difficult for people to make mistakes, and for an organisation to let people make mistakes. I'm going to talk now about a study I did quite a number of years ago. It was my PhD study, but it does have some relevance. So what I did was I talked to nurses at the end of their course. I'm very interested in what happens to new staff, and my very strong belief is that people come into nursing, into medicine, because they want to care and because they feel very idealistic often about that. They want to change the world and they want to make people better, and that's fantastic, and they're the kind of people we want. Robert Francis said we need to recruit people with excellent values and ideals and the best people. And I totally agree. What I would challenge in that is that there was somehow an assumption that we weren't, that we hadn't been. And actually, what I would say is we have been recruiting the very best, very often. And what we've been doing is eroding their values and eroding their compassion and their desire to do good over time. And so some of the most idealist students can become the most burnt out. I didn't set out to answer that question. What I did set out to do was to ask students at the end of their course, so if you could practice in any way you wanted to, what would you like to do? How would you like to nurse? And they gave me some examples. I've got one shortly. And then, rather cruelly, I followed them up 3 times, and I said, or a sample of them, and I said to them, remember you said this, had it all written down. Can you do it? And if you can, what helps? And if you can't, what gets in the way? And as you saw, I followed them up over a number of times. And this, rather sadly, got the same colours. Perhaps the threat environment are the reds and so on, but yeah, how interesting. This was my analysis. So out of those 26 people, and this was in a very short time, people were in these categories, that they're my categories, they're my analysis. They're what I called crushed idealists, so compromised idealists and sustained idealists. So the 4 in the blue were those that were in an environment that supported their ideals of practice, gave them the tools to do good work and practice in the way that they wanted to practice. 2 of them, interestingly, had to move environments to find them. It wasn't in their original environment, so there was often this job hopping, moving around to try and find this sort of ideal environment. Lots of nods in the room. We've probably all done that a bit. The compromised idealists, as you can see, were the biggest group, and that meant that on a daily basis they were compromising at least one of their ideals. So they were having to not spend time with patients, or having to ignore things, or not able to practice in a way they wanted. And actually they were the most distressed group. The crushed idealists had almost got to the end of the road. They were very burnt out, and remember this was within 15 months. They were talking about leaving nursing, and they were over. They weren't over trying to try. The crushed idealists were still trying every day. They were still trying to put their ideals in practice and were constantly thwarted, and that was actually very, very distressing for them. The crushed idealists were mentally either trying to find a new practice environment, an ideal one, or they were mentally leaving nursing, and actively leaving nursing. So this is what somebody said in their questionnaire at the end of their course. I'd like to see the client as an individual, having time to support them in a holistic way, being able to pick up when they're worried or distressed, while at the same time ensuring their independence. That's what they wanted to do. And I'm now going to talk to you about tell you a story, actually, from one of my participants. And Maria was in the crushed idealist group. And she said, after just 14 months in practice, and I quote, "I felt that I'd really compromised my belief in how dying people shouldn't be alone. I definitely do compromise my ideals, like talking to patients rudely, that's one, and ideally I'd quite like to say, okay, rant and rave at me, I can sit here, I can take this, I've got half an hour to sit here with you, once you've calmed down we'll go through it, but you just haven't got that time." She went on to talk about a very busy night shift. This woman just started screaming and screaming at the top of her voice. I still hadn't done my IVs and there was loads to do. I went in there and I said, "Will you just be quiet for 5 minutes, just be quiet, I'll shut the door and you can calm down and I'll come back." And as I shut the door, she really started screaming, really loud, and the sister walked on and started saying, "What do you think you're doing?" I said, "Okay, I know I'm wrong, but I'm at the end of my tether here." I really felt that I'd compromised myself then because I was so rude. I felt I'd compromised myself as a person. That was horrible. I didn't even compromise my ideal, I lost one. I was just so tired and at the end of my tether. And I had many experiences myself as a nurse, and I felt that in those situations I had very little support. One can see it from the ward sister's perception coming on, seeing this disastrous situation, but actually that nurse is talking about being at the end of her tether, not having resilience, nobody taught her how to cope with these difficult things. This was another of my interviewees. Sometimes I go home thinking I didn't even see a patient today, and it did feel like that sometimes, a terrible shift where all you've done is paperwork and drugs, and that's it. You haven't even spoken to any of your patients. It wasn't care because you just didn't see them. And what I see now increasingly is registered nurses in particular. I think a lot of the bedside care, being with patients as they die, the hands-on care that people come into nursing to give are now given by healthcare assistants. So registered nurses are often doing this stuff. That's not what they came into nursing to do. Paperwork, drug rounds. People spend hours and hours going around with the drugs. And that's very demotivating for staff. Another one, I felt quite sad I'm not able to give my all to patient care all the time. I still want to. I do feel quite drained when I come in from work because I'm trying to sit down and talk with patients as well as get on with everything else I've got to do. That will probably get less and less as I get more experience. So she's expecting things to change. I'm slightly less compassionate than perhaps I would be if I was a student, which is not a good thing. As a student, you're so much more hands on hand to sit with patients and hold their hands and talk to them. And when I'm really tired, I know I can feel myself. It's awful knowing I'm different with the patients, but when you haven't got time and you're really busy, I know I'm just impatient with them and I just feel awful. And the challenges staff talked about in terms of their environment were these things: feeling a time pressure, feeling constrained in their role. This is what I've talked about in terms of the registered nurse role. A lack of support, staff shortages and work overload, and being task, not patient orientated. But out of this work, what I suggested was what we needed in terms of positive environments of care were good role models. People talked about being in an environment where if they saw somebody practicing in a way that they knew they wanted to give care, they could think, great, okay, that person can do it, it can be done. Whereas if they had too many what I called negative role models, people who were just going through the motions, out of the door at bang on 4 o'clock, if there were too many of those, that was very distressing and very negative. Adequate staff and good skill mix. We've had this week the NICE guidelines, which I'm very happy to talk about. There's been a bit of poor messaging around that. We were talking about that earlier. Ideas welcomed and changed, encouraged. These students actually thought they were going to go out and change the world. They were some of the early Project 2000 students, and they really thought their ideas would be welcomed, and they'd be welcomed with open arms with new ideas. What they found were staff saying, this is how we do it here. The practice environment wasn't prepared to receive these change agents, if you like. So they became very demotivated there. Support for staff, we talked about mentorship and preceptorship. A long time ago I did my master's thesis on preceptorship and argued it should be mandatory. And preceptorship is the support period for new staff where they're actively mentored and managed by a senior colleague to help them become qualified nurses. And absolutely this philosophy of care that supports compassionate care. And going back to one of my interviews, they talked about burnout, and I can see it happening already. I think it's just the fact it's a very stressful environment. You can see yourself getting worn out and your energy level depleting, and you are dissatisfied. You're just too busy to show people that you're being compassionate. That's so important to patients. You just need to remember how every little thing you do is so frightening to them. But when you're tired, I don't think it's I care any less. Sometimes I just haven't got the energy to show it. And this slide is work from my colleague, Anne-Marie Rafferty. Is this a pointer?
Yes.
Great, thank you. And what it shows here is this is the number of nurses, number of patients looked after each nurse. And interesting, it's 8 here. That was the announcement this week. But as the number of patients each nurse goes up, so does the quality of care goes down, because that's poor quality of care going up. Emotional exhaustion goes up, that's an element of burnout, job dissatisfaction, and interestingly, actually patient mortality. This is large data sets put together. And more recently, colleagues have replicated this study across 10 countries in Europe, and this is work my colleagues Jane Ball and Anne-Marie Rafferty have done, and what this slide shows is the amount of care was left undone because of lack of time. So nurses were asked, it's nearly 3,000 registered nurses in 401 general medical and surgical wards in 46 English acute trusts. This is the English data. So they were asked on the last shift, was there anything you couldn't do because of lack of time? And these were the things. And look down here. Educating patients and families, comfort talk with patients. What we know are these are some of the most important things for patients and their families, and yet this is the care that nurses are saying they're not able to do and not able to give on their shifts. Very few other of these countries are anywhere like the number, apart from Spain here perhaps, but England certainly stands out in this data. Oh, yeah, there we go. And this is a paper, if you're interested in BMJ quality and safety, talking about this work. Also, going beyond my data, this is a paper we wrote some time ago, but talking about, it's not just my work, but there's a body of work, that this is a meta-ethnography of a range of literature talking about how nurses do aspire to these therapeutic relationships with patients. They want to connect with them, they want to get to know individual patients and involve patients in their care. And if nurses can deliver the quality of care that matches their personal aspiration and that's best for the patients, they experience feelings of gratification, personal enrichment and privilege. If not, they encounter moral distress. And they encountered most moral distress caring for these sorts of patients, or not being able to care well for these sorts of patients. In fact, dying patients where they can't relieve suffering, caring for patients with dementia, and older people where there just isn't the capacity to provide adequate care. And we've seen quite a lot of that in the media. But that's very distressing to nurses. And in one of the studies, the nurse talked about, I think it's like a plastic shield that you put up, and I think if you stick at it long enough and you're in the job long enough, it becomes a natural way. And thinking about Chris's work, I think, and the resilience work, I think what we want to do is try and stop that plastic shield going up and give people the capacity to empathise enough, but also have some distance so that you can cope. Because as Chris talked about, you can't constantly empathise and be engaged with every single amount of suffering. And it's not only nurses. This was a headline last year in the Boston Globe talking about the empathy gap in medical students and how stress can harden students' attitudes towards patients. Students often believe they have to maintain a distance from patients to protect themselves, and they talk about it being time-consuming and physically draining to be involved in a very emotional situation. And the author of this study, they talked about medical students come in with a lot of idealism, they want to be of help and service, and then something starts to happen when they're exposed to clinical care. Well, I could have written that piece myself. It's exactly the same as my findings from nursing. But he talks about what he called the hidden curriculum. Senior doctors emphasise that medicine is a business, certainly in the US anyway, and probably increasingly here. There's a lack of positive role models that might lead students to believe that human connection is of little importance. And students might select when to turn on their empathy switch and when not, and learn how to be efficient with their empathy over time. And so over the last 20 years of my research, I've argued that supporting staff well at work is absolutely key to enabling them to flourish, to be compassionate and to care well for patients. It's also key to creating positive environments to staff to work in, particularly attending to their psychological well-being. And in 2008, I undertook a study looking at links between staff well-being and patient experience. There was a nationally funded NIHR study, and at that time it was purportedly self-evident that patient experiences were influenced by staff well-being, but we didn't actually have much evidence in health and at the team level. I think now, sort of 6 years later, I think this is often taken for granted, and people sort of say, well, we know that. Well, actually, we didn't know that. And what we didn't know, the study we did, was looking at it at the individual and team level and how important it was there. So on this study, we asked which dimensions of staff experience and well-being impact on relationships of care, and which organisational and contextual factors most shape experiences of work and experiences of care in healthcare organisations. And really, it's this question: do happy staff mean happy patients? And this is these briefing documents we produced at the National Nursing Research Unit, and this is one on this study, just a briefing of this. What we did was we went to 4 organisations, 4 trusts, with lovely arboreal pseudonyms there: Oakfield, Elmwick, Ashcroft and Larchmere. And we went to talk to chief executives, directors, members of trade unions, clergy, pastors, directors of nursing. We went to a whole range of people and said, help us, where is either staff well-being or patient experience low in your organisation, and where is it high? And so we were deliberately selecting these extreme cases, the low and high performing microsystems. And very interestingly, I'm sure this won't be any surprise to Donna, senior managers know exactly where the high and low performing areas in their organisation are. And this is where we went. We went to the emergency admissions area. We were also keen to sort of get different so-called dwell times, so looking at how staff have to interact differently with, for example, in A&E, to older people, to maternity, and hemato-oncology, where you often get highly motivated staff giving cancer care to patients. And this is the findings of the study. What we found was there is a relationship between staff well-being and patient care performance, and staff well-being is an important antecedent of patient care performance. And so that means it's the experience of healthcare staff that shapes patient experiences of care for good or ill, not the other way around. And there were these 7 staff variables that we called well-being bundles that correlate positively with patient-reported experience. And interestingly, this is very different from evidence outside of health. Outside of health, it's the 4th one down, organisational climate, that seems to be most important. In this study, it was the local work group climate. It's your team, it's your individual colleagues, the people you interact with day to day. Makes sense, doesn't it? I think for all of us that resonates, because that's where you spend most time. Co-worker support, job satisfaction, organisational support, organisational climate, low emotional exhaustion and supervisor support. And there's a very busy slide now, but it's really showing you these elements on a slide put together with the patient experience data. So the dotted lines are patient experience measures, different measures over here. We use lots of different measures, pick a standard, pick and a peach survey, which actually stands for patient emotional experiences of care in hospital. And the hard lines are these variables I just showed you on the other side here: organisational climate, local work group climate, and so on. What I really want you to notice is where Staff well-being, as measured by these elements, is low, so is patient experience. I think I've got another, there we go, low, and where it is high, so is staff experience. So there is this link here. And factors shaping staff experience, drilling down into the local work group climate a little bit more, it was this idea of demanding work, high demand work with little control. Some of you might know the work of Karasek, who talks about high demand, low control. And it's where you've just got this constant pull and drive, lots and lots of the blue, and actually little control over how you manage your work. People talked about, particularly in an area that I'm going to talk a little bit more about, in the older people's wards. We looked at 4 wards in this group, and they were it was a very, very poor working environment. There was lots of very overt incivility to each other. I couldn't quite believe it as a researcher walking into a ward where people were being extremely rude to each other and thinking that that was absolutely fine with a research stranger in the room. That in meetings people were lots of eye rolling when certain people spoke, all sorts of bullying. People talked about a very bullying culture, but they also said we used to have a family at work here. We used to be a team. We used to go out. We don't do that anymore. There was these schisms we talked about, and in this particular team, the schisms were often between the registered nurses and the healthcare assistants. They didn't feel they understood each other's work very well. The healthcare assistants felt put upon to do a lot of the sort of dirty work in sociological terms, and that the registered nurses felt very unsatisfied because they were going around doing the paperwork and the drugs, and that wasn't what they came into nursing to do. There was also it was a very ethnically mixed environment, and there was quite a lot of challenge between different groups. There has been a lot of overseas recruitment, and there was a lot of challenge between those groups where people didn't really understand or connect with each other and didn't go out together. And so there were people lamenting that it used to be a good place to work and it wasn't anymore. And these other elements I've talked about already: job satisfaction, adequate staff, and good managers and leaders, critically, who listen and respond. That was really, really important. This paper I just wanted to draw your attention to. This is going back to this older people's nursing setting, and what we argued in this paper is called Poppets and Parcels, the links between staff experience of work and acutely older people's experience of hospital care, is that where the work environment was deeply unsatisfying for staff, they made it satisfying in different ways by selectively giving care to what they called the poppets. So those patients they either felt sorry for or endeared themselves in some way, perhaps people who didn't get many visitors or who were particularly... It's drawing on the unpopular patient literature, Felicity Stockwell's work from quite a number of years ago, which left other patients feeling quite like parcels. And we had many quotes of people saying, I don't feel a person anymore, I feel like I'm being moved like a parcel from chair to bed. And there's no blame in this. It's very much saying it was an environment where people were really struggling and staff were finding it very difficult to work there. So in a way to make their work meaningful, they selectively gave good care to some patients because that gave some satisfaction, but meant other patients didn't get such good care. What one hopes is that everyone had different poppets on the ward, but I'm not sure that that's what we saw. Or different patients were poppets to different staff. Going back, this is Mid Staffordshire Hospital, many of you will know, and this quote is from the first inquiry report, and it's a doctor in A&E saying, thinking about Donna's experience, I've never met a nurse who comes to work to do a bad job. The nurses were so under-resourced to give adequate care to patients. If you're in that environment for long enough, what happens is you become immune to the sound of pain, or you walk away. You cannot feel people's pain. You cannot continue to want to do the best you possibly can when the system says no to you. You can't do the best you can. And one of the doctors in the study I talked about earlier, the links between staff wellbeing and patient experience, said everyone will say you need to be good at communicating, you need to be good at basic science, but one of the main things I think you need is resilience. Because you work in a job that knocks you down constantly, you've just got to brush yourself off, pick yourself up and say that was bad, that was awful, but here we go again. I think if you take it all home with you and if you take it all on board, you simply wouldn't be able to come back to work the next day. In conclusion, really, I just wanted to, I'd added to the sort of bricks in the wall of the positive environments of care, the bottom bricks are from the staff experience study. This one is from a study I did in between, which I haven't had time to talk about tonight, but this is where staff felt valued, got feedback, and so on. This is the sort of family at work and the other elements I talked about. And I just want to just spend the last couple of minutes talking about this, because I think this is really, really important. And I think we've lost this in so many settings in the NHS, this space to talk about work and to even talk about patients, frankly. I was rather horrified to hear recently a newly qualified nurse doesn't even get handover from a person. She gets a handover from a taped handover. So she doesn't get handover about her patients. She just sits and listens to a tape recorder. And I'm not very fond of nurses who kind of say, in my day, but I'm afraid I'm going to say it a little bit. In my day, when I was very much on the front line, there used to be opportunities. We worked shorter shifts. We didn't work 12-hour shifts. We used to go off to lunch together. We would maybe even stop for tea occasionally. My God, what a luxury that was. But we would find time to talk to each other. We'd often go out after work to the pub, particularly if there'd been a very distressing incident that you needed to process with each other. In handovers, you would find time to talk about patients and to talk about how you were managing this patient and sharing information. We've really lost those spaces and places. It may surprise some of you to know that registered general nurses and doctors do not get regular clinical supervision. Mental health nurses do, and midwives get supervision, slightly different, but in clinical supervision you may expect to have an opportunity to process those really challenging things. And my final slide, I think it is, I just want to draw your attention to this work. You may know of it. Again, Jocelyn Cornwall, the Point of Care programme has brought this from Boston in the US. They're called Schwartz Rounds, from the Schwartz Centre for Compassionate Care. This chap here is Kenneth B. Schwartz, who the centre's named after. He died in his 40s of lung cancer. And what he noted when he was having care from his caregivers, as they're called in the States, was that some people could be very empathetic, could go the extra mile, could really identify with his situation, ask him about his children, and others were blind to that and really kind of didn't engage with him. And actually the same people could do it one day and not the other day. So it got him to thinking about that, what was going on there. And in his memory, his oncologist set up Schwartz Rounds. And Schwartz Rounds are a multidisciplinary forum. Some of you may have experienced them. I can see people in the audience who have certainly experienced them. And they're going on largely at the moment in acute trust, but they're going to move to community trust. They're in Paul Gilbert's mental health trust. And staff, any staff can come. Staff come together once a month. They get lunch. They have an hour. And they fill a space. And there is a team who presents an ethical, moral, social dilemma. So something that has really troubled you. We all have patients who we will never ever forget, who have troubled us in all sorts of ways. And they will talk about that, and they will talk about how it made them feel. It's not about problem solving, it's not a grand medical round, it's not about talking about tests and diagnoses. It is for staff to talk about these difficult emotional challenges they face every single day of their working lives. And sitting, I've observed 4 now, and sitting in them, honestly, the hairs on the back of my neck have stood up when a consultant talked about waking up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat because he still didn't know if the decision he made a year ago was the right one. And it took a year for him to know that sectioning a person, a young woman who was not having dialysis, was the right thing to do. And our colleagues in the NHS live with these dilemmas and these, deaths of babies. Could that have been prevented? They question themselves and carry this great burden of guilt often. So if you can find a Schwartz round, do go and observe. And if you can't find one, get your trust to start them. I've actually just got a grant from NIHR to evaluate them, so I'm looking forward to doing that work. And thank you very much for listening.
2 excellent talks and fantastic work. I think you've both slightly, though, let the NHS off the hook. I don't think you have portrayed it as toxic as it is at the moment. And I worry in particular about the resilience agenda, because you train resilience for an environment, and whilst you can remove people and train them once you put them in the environment, and I'm finding that the fastest rising group to my service are young female doctors within 4 years of qualification, so echoes very, very much with what you're saying, who are burnt out, who want to leave medicine. Now, I've written a paper recently which actually said the two major problems that we need to address are creating an empathic environment back into the NHS, which is what both of you said, and also reducing the name, blame, shame culture, which is endemic, and I think you've said that about the fear. Unless we do this together, with a momentum, all together, which is what I think we all have to do, I fear for the next decade. I actually don't think there's any... I fear for hope. I think we're seeing the industrialisation, the marketisation of healthcare destroying the social solidarity that we've built up. So I just want to say that you're inspiring, but I think you let us off the hook. I think it's actually even worse than you both say. So it's not a question, it's a statement. But we are going to do something about it, ladies and gentlemen, because I want to do stuff. So I think we will create a movement around changing all of this. So watch this space.
I think you're right, Claire, but I'm going to challenge you back, because the NHS is a toxic environment, but it's made up of individuals. And I'll just give you an example that it takes an individual to recognise the distress. And I know that a week ago, and it didn't even cross my mind until I was listening to you, Chris, but there was a young doctor standing in my A&E department, and she was crying. And I walked round, and I was on my way to somewhere else, and she said to me, she is so horrible about a patient. You know, she'd obviously been dressed down. And I was trying to get to somewhere else. I didn't have 10 minutes to spend to say, you know, think like this, do this, or whatever. And I said to her, go over there, take a deep breath, and think of her as your grandmother. That's all I could say, because I was on my way through. So just think she's your grandmother, and see if you can go back in. And I'd totally forgotten it. A week passed by, and she said, I bumped into her, because in A&E the doctors change all the time. I bumped into her, and she said to me, do you know, that patient was so distressed that actually, when I thought of her as my grandmother, she opened up to me. So she wasn't really the most horrible person that she was. And I think each of us can do a little bit. I didn't say a great much. I didn't give a speech. It was just think of her as your grandmother. And I do think it is a toxic environment, but we are the people that make up that toxic environment. So if we don't become compassionate, then there isn't anybody above us, because the targets do poison us.
I absolutely agree. I mean, please don't get me wrong, but you said we need to pull our own oxygen mask down, and actually I think that's absolutely right, and we should treat them. But when you have doctors killing themselves, which you have now at the highest rate, when you have levels of sickness, when you have levels of complaints, I think it is stop being the Messiah, because unfortunately doctors and nurses do think they're the Messiah, and they deal with their own adversity by working harder, because that's what we're taught to do. So I think I'm absolutely convinced we can sort it. I'm not being nihilistic about this, but I think we've got to stop thinking now that we can work our way out of this, and we've got to start challenging the politicians to do things like stop the name blame, like stop CQC, like look at the GMC and what's going on, and to put safe staffing levels, and to put Schwartz groups, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah.
I'm going to do the runaround.
So much, just another side of this that worries me a bit is that solidarity that Claire spoke about also needs to be between the staff and the patients. And I kind of felt very much as if the patients had kind of disappeared in this discussion. I mean, not that they're being done too, but the empowerment of patients is so important that they feel that they can have proper conversations, proper discussions. Because it isn't about sort of you're coming to give me care, but actually, how do I approach you as a practitioner? How do I make sure that we build a proper relationship? To me, the passive patient should be part of history, but the truth is that many patients feel it's really difficult to have proper conversations in which they present their ideas and their thoughts, and they develop a proper relationship with the practitioner. So the practitioner feels as if they are in a relationship rather than just doing something to patients. So I think we need to consider that element of it in terms of building the proper sort of solidarity.
I think you're right. I do. Does anyone want to come back on that from the
No, I mean, I think that's a very fair point. I completely agree. We see some of it. I work in a mental health trust, and over the last 10, 15, 20 years, you do see strides to try to help to promote patients leading all sorts of things, and we do have a huge increase, in terms of, patients being on interview panels.
Your trust has got a good
reputation. Through to all sorts of different things. But you're absolutely right. We need to do more of it. Absolutely. And also just coming back to the first point that's made, I completely agree as well in terms, the whole point about this is thinking about what creates threat environments and on what levels can we begin to intervene. The first thing is we have never gone around trying to teach or help or cultivate our individual staff to know how to deal with this stuff. We've just assumed, and of course what we're teaching though, or training is do more, work harder, be this tough person. And of course, unless we start helping people to recognise this causes problems, but you're completely right as well. What I didn't include here is, how do we go up higher and actually get up there to the politicians and saying, you are killing people. You are killing the system if you keep on doing this. So you're absolutely right. But what I would say is that we need it on every single level that we would bring this in. So.
We'll come to you in a minute next.
Just a comment on that really. Chris Irons from Upstream Healthcare. There's an issue here in which we all share and we all have in common, whatever our role is as doctors, patients, whatever position we're in terms of the semantics and the literature and the language, and that is that we're all people, first and foremost. We're all wired exactly the same way. Distressed doctors, distressed teachers, distressed public servants are in exactly the same boat as the distressed people they're seeing. And it is incumbent upon, I think, all the leaders in all professions, us, to work together as people, first and foremost, to turn this huge super tanker around. It's not going to happen if we sit in our traditional tribes. It's not going to happen if we sit in our patient tribe, if we sit in our doctor tribe. We have got to claim our humanity, our shared humanity, the shared ways in which we all work, all of us, and actually get this message over to people. And I mean, we've got a year coming up to the next election. We can take some serious high ground here, and as Claire is encouraging us and supporting us to do, work together collaboratively in a country that is obsessed with competition to get this absolutely dead centre of the agenda in ways that make it completely unignorable. We have the neuroscience, the epigenetics, we have all this evidence. There is nowhere that any politician can go where we will not believe in them. And we need to think about doing this soon. We need to get organised and focused and work together, because a lot of things are going pear-shaped for a lot of people. A lot of the people coming in who are patients are teachers, nurses, others working in the public sector, being Ofsteded and all the rest of it. We are living in a culture of complete drone cyborgism. And we, as responsible professional people, have got a duty of care to our culture and our society to turn that round. And I share with Claire the plea to us all to start working together to do that.
You're going to have to call time on this, David, I think. But I know I'm going to go to you next. I'll just start with you because you tried to interview.
It's very short. It's just that he said, he knocked it on the head there, he said, the evidence is there, and if the politician wants to change the system, just going to say, obviously they're out to save people's lives working with the NHS, but if they start to mess with the system, they need to have an evidence-based system to change the opinion. And I think if you were trying to bring in a new drug, if you were trying to bring in a new method, you'd have to have it on a research-based system. And why is it politicians allowed just on the whim of these ideas to say, look, I want to do it this way?
I'm really sorry to keep harping back on, but last year, you will have heard that we've got to now have a ratio of nursing 1 to 8 patients. So last year, I looked around my department, I thought 108 was the average age, now 90 to 100 was the average age of patients. So the nurses said, well, they're in our department for so long, Don, we need some beds. So I said, okay, let's order the beds. CQC said, you're really wrong because you're creating, thick mattresses for old people to lie on. That creates a ward in ED. That's not what an ED is for. So I then thought, let's have a ratio of 1 to 4 nurses. Okay, so a year ago I go to 1 to 4 nurses. And then I realised that I have to put my uniform on and actually work with those nurses, because they've never had a ratio of 1 to 4, so they really don't know what to do. So they're still hiding from the patients, and they still don't want to engage in a conversation. And so actually, we are in a situation where you're going to have to reteach those skills of what you and I, Jill, took for granted when we were students and had better ratios. Actually, you and then you.
Thank you. I'm Jocelyn Cornwell from the Point of Care Foundation. Just before everybody gets carried away with the idea that this is all an NHS thing and that this is a UK thing, I just wanted to make the point that internationally you see exactly the same problems in advanced healthcare systems. So I think it's actually too simple to say this is all our NHS that has gone wrong. And I was very struck, Jill, in one of your slides, which was the one about the tasks left undone, Anne-Marie and Jane Ball's work, about the hierarchy of tasks that were left undone. I mean, clearly there was a hierarchy in countries too, but the tasks that were left undone were the relational ones, weren't they? And it seems to me that one of the things that hasn't been talked about at all tonight, because in a way there's a kind of atmosphere a little bit which is like somebody else is to blame, or, you know, is that medicine itself and the medical model has structured, I think, the way that the healthcare system operates in such a way that relational matters, and particularly the complexity of some of the things in the care of older people that we see now, has actually been ignored. And so it's the clinical and the transactional that the nurses were doing first and foremost, and that was more important than enablement of patients or dealing with suffering. And so I think it's just a plea really for us to think harder about both medicine itself and the medical model, but also about power. And there's been no discussion of power whatsoever tonight, and yet all your examples of violence you could reinterpret as symptoms of gross inequalities of power. And there's something about the structures of power in healthcare itself and the power of professionals over patients that I think is missing from this discussion.
I guess just to feedback on that, you're absolutely right, but the thing is here is what turns off this capacity in our human brain for great care and compassion. And you're absolutely right, there's all sorts of factors. It's another talk to really go into this. Power is one, dissociation from suffering.
Right to reply.
Yeah, dissociation from suffering is another. You're absolutely right that we have to think about this on multiple levels, because...
Yeah, but I suppose the difference between you and me, Chris, is that I'm a sociologist and you're a psychologist. So for me, what's really interesting is how do you create the conditions in environments that and how do you design empathy into them? And I think that goes beyond...
I would say that would be very important for me as well, to be honest.
The individual is very important, but it's some of the features of the system that I think I'd like to talk about more as well.
Sure.
I just want to say something very briefly about that. I've got a fantastic colleague in the National Nursing Research Unit who's been doing some great observational work on older people's wards. And what she observes is some excellent care. One of her observations was that to empower a man, to enable him to do his own transfer from his chair onto a weighing machine and back took 45 minutes. And all the healthcare assistant could record for that, all that was obvious from that, in lots of invisible care, that 45 minutes of care was that he got weighed. And it would have been so much easier to just manhandle him out of his chair and into the weighing machine. And yet this healthcare assistant did an amazing job, and Caroline's got this fantastic sort of blow-by-blow account of this sort of whole 45 minutes and him saying, don't hurry me and wait, and don't let me fall. And in the end, he allowed himself to be helped. But 45 minutes, and I worry and wonder if we can really, really, really afford the care we want to have. Because with our older population, having recently gone back to practice, what I noticed was the complex, multiple morbidities, people with, complex conditions, much older, much frailer, needing 2 people to help them to the toilet. That is very, very expensive, and I think we're not as a nation having a debate about can we really, really afford the care. And I said a while ago, will it be a luxury to be looked after by a registered nurse? And I say it again, and I think it probably will be in my lifetime.
Okay, I can see you, but I've got one up there, so I'm going to be a tennis star now. Oh, can you? I'm going to climb the fences.
I was quite taken with Chris's 3 systems, and I suppose what struck me was, my name's very clever by the way, and it's about the one that delivers contentment and safety. And I suppose I wanted to know, had you done that work or research where people drew it in areas where good practice happened? Because you did it sort of in the NHS. But
Yes.
I thought it would be quite interesting to do, because I think what I would think is that even if you're in a threat environment, if you have something that provides that safety and contentment, then you can still, the balance is right, really. And I suppose what my thoughts are is that currently I work in a hospice, which could be considered a highly threat environment. And I think that we have to make sure that balance is there all the time. And the way that happens is by managers giving people the time to listen to what's going on. I spend loads of time listening to people, hearing what they're saying, hearing their experience, listening to staff.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems to be able to keep people in a safe place.
I absolutely agree. I mean, it's a great research question. Anecdotally, it's absolutely what we get. That when people are in environments in which they feel supported and cared for and so forth, there is enough of the green, the sense of feeling valued, being seen, being supported, and actually the capacity, therefore, to be able to withstand threats is significant as an individual. But I guess coming back to some of the points that have been made here, we're absolutely not just thinking about the individual at all. In fact, a lot of what I was talking about is about the nature of the system and how much threat can be created within the system coming down rank from above. So you're absolutely right. This is essential because we want to be doing it both ways, really. And there are wonderful...
recognition of what's required, because there are areas where
Yeah,
it's happened.
absolutely. And learning from some of these environments where it's going well, how can we learn from these and begin to replicate, do more of these things?
Last question.
I think in the last few years I've worked in elderly care all my life in rehabilitation, and up until I would say probably about 2 weeks ago was counting the days till I stopped doing the job I'm doing. I burnt out at the end of last year completely. I just taken on a practice educator role at the Royal Free. I've been there a week and a half, and what's been talked about there really resonates in the new role that I'm taking on, that I'm there to enable staff to have that time, to enable them to have the education to be able to build those bridges between themselves and their patients. And I think it's the first time in a long time I remember what is being a nurse and to enjoy what I do. I'm actually staying home, is that true? And I really enjoy what I'm doing. I hope it's a week and a half. And I can see this is going to be such an opportunity. And if I can start weaving some of these threads of resilience into those teams and upwards through to the systems as well, then I'll do so much in that way. So thank you for this opportunity.
I think that's a really good note to end on, so thank you very much for that.